February 26, 1991. Along the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border, night settled heavily over the desert. Visibility collapsed as fog mixed with smoke from burning oil wells, turning the open terrain into a shifting gray wall. For Iraqi commanders, this weather was not a liability. It was doctrine made manifest. Since the Second World War, reduced visibility had been the defenders' ally. Fog slowed advances, fractured formations, disrupted command and control, and neutralized air power. In Iraqi planning, a large-scale armored attack under these conditions was considered not just unlikely, but operationally irrational. The Iraqi Republican Guard divisions positioned in this sector were not ad hoc formations. They represented the regime's strategic reserve, rebuilt and re-equipped after 8 years of war with Iran. Their defensive concept was rooted in Soviet-style layered positions. Forward screening units, dug-in armor in battle positions, interlocking fields of fire, and pre-registered engagement areas designed to channel any attacker into kill zones. Iraqi officers expected any American movement to be road-bound, slow, and hesitant. Navigation in featureless desert at night, especially in heavy weather, traditionally required halts, compass checks, and visual confirmation. That assumption shaped everything from gun orientation to logistics staging. What Iraqi planners did not anticipate was a convergence of systems that fundamentally altered how armored forces could move and fight at night. By early 1991, the U.S. 2nd Armored Division had trained extensively for limited visibility maneuver. Its doctrine emphasized continuous movement, decentralized execution, and engagement on terms dictated by sensors rather than eyesight. Tanks were no longer tethered to daylight or clear horizons. The division's Abrams battalions were built around thermal imaging, stabilized fire control, digital navigation aids, and radios designed to function inside sealed, noise-isolated fighting compartments. As the storm intensified, coalition air power was largely grounded. Fixed-wing strike aircraft and attack helicopters were unable to operate effectively under the low cloud ceiling. From the Iraqi perspective, this confirmed their assessment. The most dangerous American advantage had been neutralized. What remained, they believed, was a conventional armored force facing the same physical limitations as everyone else. Darkness, fog, and rain were expected to level the battlefield. Instead, those conditions became the backdrop for a doctrinal collision. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division did not pause to reconsolidate or wait for improved weather. Its forward elements crossed phase lines at speed, navigating without visible landmarks, maintaining formation integrity, and scanning the battlefield through sensors unaffected by darkness. To the naked eye, the desert appeared empty. To the Iraqi crews waiting in their positions, there were no approaching silhouettes, no engine noise carrying through the storm, no visual cues that an attack was underway. And then, without warning, armored vehicles began to disappear. The first reports coming from Iraqi forward units were confused rather than panicked. Crews described single vehicles being destroyed without warning, their turrets torn free or hulls penetrated cleanly, yet no corresponding flashes or incoming fire could be identified. Standard battlefield cues were absent. There was no preparatory artillery barrage, no visible tracer fire, no aircraft overhead. For Iraqi commanders trained to read combat through sound and sight, this absence of indicators created immediate uncertainty. Tanks do not simply explode on their own, and in traditional armor doctrine, every engagement leaves signatures. Iraqi night fighting capability relied primarily on active infrared systems and image intensifiers. These technologies, effective under clear conditions, depended on projecting infrared light and reading its reflection. In heavy fog and rain, however, moisture particles scattered those signals, degrading range and clarity. Crews attempting to search their sectors were often confronted with washed-out displays and false returns. Engines idled, turrets traversed, and infrared searchlights swept empty darkness. The battlefield, as perceived through Iraqi optics, was fragmented and unreliable. At the same time, American Abrams crews were seeing a fundamentally different environment. Their primary thermal sights operated by detecting temperature differentials rather than reflected light. Cold sand and rain-cooled ground contrasted sharply with the heat signatures of diesel engines, exhaust systems, and recently fired gun barrels. Even through fog and precipitation, those thermal contrasts remained visible. Targets that were invisible to the human eye appeared as distinct shapes at ranges well beyond Iraqi effective night engagement distances. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division's engagement methodology reflected this asymmetry. Abrams units advanced in bounded formations, maintaining spacing while firing on the move. Fire control systems stabilized the main gun independently of hull motion, allowing accurate engagement at speed. Crews did not wait to identify targets visually. Identification was based on thermal profile, movement patterns, and confirmed grid positions passed over secure radios. Once a target was acquired, engagements were rapid and decisive, often completed before the Iraqi crew understood they were under attack. As losses mounted, Iraqi attempts to respond followed established doctrine. Units increased rates of fire, attempting to suppress presumed enemy positions. This reaction only worsened the disparity. Each shot heated gun barrels and engine compartments, further brightening thermal signatures. Movement, especially repositioning or withdrawal, made vehicles even more visible. What Iraqi crews experienced as an invisible threat was, in practice, a force that could see them with increasing clarity the more they reacted. By the time divisional headquarters began to recognize that a major armored formation was operating inside their defensive belt, cohesion was already eroding. Communications degraded as units reported contradictory threat directions. Defensive geometry, carefully planned for a visible attacker, lost meaning when engagement vectors could not be identified. The fog that had been expected to shield Iraqi positions instead amplified their exposure, turning concealment into a liability rather than protection. As the engagement deepened, the Iraqi command structure struggled to impose order on a battlefield it could no longer interpret. Reports arriving from battalions and companies described fire coming from multiple directions simultaneously, often from ranges considered impractical under the prevailing conditions. In Soviet-influenced defensive planning, such reports usually indicated infiltration or special forces activity. That assumption delayed recognition of the true situation. The possibility that an American heavy armored division was maneuvering at speed, at night, through fog contradicted decades of operational experience. Iraqi doctrine emphasized positional defense. Tanks were expected to fight from prepared battle positions, engines running intermittently to preserve readiness while minimizing thermal and acoustic signatures. But once contact was made, survival depended on coordinated fires and timely maneuver. That coordination broke down as units failed to establish where the enemy actually was. Radio traffic increased, but clarity did not. Calls for fire overlapped. Grid references conflicted. Some units reported enemy tanks directly in front of them. Others described engagements on their flanks or rear. The defensive line, rather than absorbing an attack, began to dissolve into isolated pockets of resistance. Inside American formations, the experience was markedly different. Abrams crews operated within a coherent information loop. Thermal sights, laser rangefinders, and digital navigation data reinforced one another. Commanders could correlate what they saw on their displays with known phase lines and unit boundaries. Engagements followed a disciplined rhythm. Detection, identification, range confirmation, and fire. Sabot rounds, fired from 120mm smoothbore guns, struck with enough velocity to defeat Iraqi armor decisively, often resulting in catastrophic kills. These outcomes were not anomalies. They were expected performance based on testing, training, and doctrine. One of the most significant factors was navigation. U.S. armored units were not navigating by terrain features or road networks. They relied on satellite-based positioning receivers that provided continuous location data even in zero-visibility conditions. This allowed formations to maintain alignment, avoid obstacles, and maneuver off established routes without hesitation. Iraqi defensive plans, oriented toward roads and assumed avenues of approach, were effectively bypassed. Engagements occurred in areas the defenders did not believe could be reached under those conditions. As American units pressed forward, they did not pause to consolidate in the traditional sense. Speed itself became a form of protection. Continuous movement reduced exposure to return fire and prevented Iraqi crews from establishing firing solutions. The battlefield became asymmetric not just in technology, but in tempo. One side reacted to events already unfolding. The other dictated when and where contact occurred. By the time Iraqi commanders attempted to order withdrawals or reposition reserves, those movements only increased losses. Vehicles breaking cover, starting engines, or shifting positions stood out immediately against the cooler background. What began as a defensive engagement transformed into a series of rapid, one-sided encounters, each eroding the Republican Guard's ability to function as a cohesive force. As the night wore on, Iraqi units attempted to adapt. Some crews shut down engines entirely, hoping to reduce their thermal signature and blend into the rain-cooled desert. Others remained motionless in prepared positions, holding fire in the belief that silence and stillness might restore concealment. These adjustments reflected sound instincts grounded in earlier conflicts, where denying the enemy observable cues often forced engagement at close range. But adaptation lagged behind the pace of events. The battlefield was already saturated with heat sources, burning vehicles, detonated ammunition, and damaged equipment. In that environment, the absence of a signature did not guarantee safety. It simply delayed detection. For American crews, the growing density of wreckage introduced a new complexity. Thermal sights excelled at detecting heat, but they did not inherently distinguish friend from foe. As formations moved deeper into Iraqi defensive zones, the risk of misidentification increased. Commanders tightened fire discipline, emphasizing confirmation through silhouette, movement, and reported unit locations. Communications remained critical. Platoon and company leaders continuously updated positions, ensuring that speed did not collapse into chaos. This was not uncontrolled momentum. It was disciplined acceleration. Close engagements began to occur as formations intermingled with Iraqi positions that had not yet been destroyed. At shorter ranges, the technological gap narrowed slightly, but not enough to reverse outcomes. Abrams tanks retained advantages in crew protection, stabilization, and rate of accurate fire. Even when Iraqi gunners managed to fire, their rounds struggled to penetrate composite armor designed to defeat contemporary threats. American crews, trained to fire while moving, often engaged targets before Iraqi turrets completed traversal. Psychological effects compounded physical losses. Iraqi soldiers encountering armored vehicles that appeared suddenly through fog, fired accurately on the move, and vanished again without clear origin experienced a rapid erosion of morale. Some infantry abandoned positions outright. Others surrendered when confronted, recognizing that resistance offered no meaningful chance of success. These reactions were not the result of cowardice but of cognitive overload. Established rules no longer explained what was happening. The environment itself seemed hostile in ways doctrine had not prepared them for. At higher command levels, situational awareness collapsed. Maps no longer reflected reality. Units marked as intact had already been destroyed or dispersed. Reserves committed late encountered American forces unexpectedly and suffered immediate losses. The tempo of the engagement denied Iraqi leadership the time required to reassess assumptions and issue coherent new orders. Decision cycles that once took hours were now irrelevant in a fight unfolding minute by minute. What emerged by the early morning hours was not a conventional breakthrough but a systemic failure. The defensive network ceased to function as a network at all. It fragmented into isolated actions with no reinforcing logic. Against a force that could see, navigate, and coordinate under conditions once thought prohibitive, the fog no longer concealed. It revealed, selectively and brutally, the limits of an entire way of war. By the final hours of darkness, the engagement had shifted from contested fighting to exploitation. American armored units were no longer encountering a coherent defensive line. Instead, they moved through a disrupted battlespace marked by destroyed vehicles, abandoned positions, and scattered pockets of resistance. The distinction between front line and rear area blurred. Supply vehicles, command posts, and reserve elements found themselves exposed, often with little warning. Iraqi operational depth, designed to absorb and slow an attacker, collapsed under a form of pressure it was never built to withstand. One of the most consequential revelations came as American forces overran Iraqi command and logistics nodes. captured maps and documents reflected an intelligence picture that lagged reality by critical hours. In some sectors, U.S. formations were not marked at all. This was not a failure of individual reporting but of the underlying assumptions guiding Iraqi situational awareness. Without continuous reconnaissance or reliable night observation, movements that deviated from expected patterns simply went undetected until contact occurred. When contact did occur, it was already too late to respond effectively. The technological foundation of the American advance was often misunderstood as a collection of isolated advantages. Thermal sights, advanced armor, and high-velocity ammunition mattered, but they were only effective because they were integrated into a coherent system. Navigation, communication, fire control, and training reinforced one another. Crews did not operate as isolated platforms. They functioned as nodes in a larger network, sharing information faster than the opposing force could process it. This integration compressed decision-making cycles and transformed speed into dominance. For Iraqi forces, the realization that weather and darkness no longer guaranteed concealment carried strategic implications beyond the immediate battle. Defensive plans across the theater relied on the assumption that environmental conditions imposed universal limits. When those limits disappeared for one side, static defenses became traps rather than protections. The battle demonstrated that survivability now depended less on position and more on information and mobility. As dawn approached, the scale of the destruction became visible. Armored vehicles lay disabled in their fighting positions, many oriented toward directions from which no enemy had ever been seen. Ammunition stocks remained unused. Units had not fled. They had been overtaken by a tempo they could not match. The outcome was not simply a defeat but a demonstration that the underlying balance between attacker and defender had shifted decisively. This was the point at which the engagement ceased to be a single-night action and became a case study. Military planners would later dissect the battle not for its individual moments, but for what it revealed about modern warfare. The fog had not hidden the attackers. It had exposed the gap between forces operating under different technological and doctrinal realities. Cumulative word count. Approximately 2,000 words. Let me know when you want the final section. When daylight finally broke over the battlefield, the fog thinned into a low gray haze, and the full consequences of the night became impossible to ignore. What had been an organized defensive sector only hours earlier was now a landscape of destroyed armor and silent positions. Many Iraqi vehicles remained exactly where doctrine had placed them, hulls oriented toward expected avenues of approach that had never materialized. They had not been outmaneuvered in the traditional sense. They had been bypassed, penetrated, and neutralized by a force operating according to a different logic of war. The significance of the action extended far beyond the tactical outcome. This was not simply a case of better equipment defeating worse equipment. It was the collision of two eras. One side fought according to assumptions shaped by decades in which darkness, weather, and terrain imposed hard limits on movement and perception. The other side had crossed a threshold where those constraints no longer applied in the same way. Thermal imaging, satellite navigation, stabilized fire control, and secure communications did not act independently. Together, they altered the geometry of the battlefield. For armored warfare, the implications were profound. Defensive depth based on concealment and fixed positions lost much of its protective value. Tempo, information flow, and sensor dominance became decisive factors. An attacking force that could move accurately without visual reference, engage effectively at night, and coordinate continuously no longer needed to wait for daylight or clear skies. The defenders' traditional advantages evaporated. In the years that followed, militaries around the world studied this engagement closely. Some focused on hardware, seeking to acquire comparable sensors or munitions. Others drew deeper lessons about integration, training, and doctrine. The most enduring conclusion was that modern combat was becoming less about who occupied the strongest position and more about who could perceive, decide, and act faster under uncertainty. The Iraqi divisions did not vanish because of fog alone. They vanished because the conditions they trusted no longer constrained their enemy. The night revealed a future in which invisibility was selective, speed was protection, and war itself had entered a new phase. If you want more deep, factual breakdowns of the battles, systems, and doctrines that reshaped modern warfare, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. There's much more to uncover. When the engagement ended, its meaning extended well beyond the wreckage left on the desert floor. What had unfolded was not simply a night battle won by superior gunnery or armor protection. It was a demonstration of how modern military power emerges from integration rather than any single breakthrough. Sensors, navigation, communications, and doctrine combined to compress time and space in ways that older defensive models could not absorb. The Iraqi formations did not fail because they lacked courage or preparation. They failed because their understanding of how battles unfold no longer matched reality. For decades, military planners assumed that environmental friction applied equally to all sides. Darkness slowed everyone. Fog blinded everyone. Bad weather imposed universal penalties. That assumption shaped force structure, defensive layouts, and training priorities. The events of this night exposed that belief as conditional rather than absolute. When one force can see, move, and coordinate without relying on the visible spectrum, environmental friction becomes asymmetric. What constrains one side empowers the other. This shift carried implications that echoed far beyond the Gulf War. Armored doctrine increasingly emphasized sensor fusion, real-time navigation, and decentralized execution supported by reliable communications. The lesson was not that technology alone wins battles, but that technology reshapes decision-making. Commanders who could trust their systems were willing to accept risks that would previously have been reckless. Speed became survivability. Movement became concealment. The battlefield ceased to be defined by what could be seen with the human eye. Equally important was the psychological dimension. Soldiers fight based on expectations as much as on orders. When those expectations collapse, when cause and effect no longer align, cohesion erodes rapidly. The inability to locate the enemy, respond effectively, or even understand how losses were occurring proved more destructive than firepower alone. The fog did not create confusion. It revealed it. The night the U.S. 2nd Armored Division struck was not the end of armored warfare, but it marked the end of an era in which weather and darkness reliably favored the defender. From that point forward, wars would be shaped by who controlled information, perception, and tempo under the worst possible conditions. If you want more grounded, in-depth examinations of the technologies and doctrines that transformed modern warfare, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for what comes next.